But if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we have to recognize that all of us in the West, not only Georgia, all of us in the West are experiencing challenges in our democracies as well. We are facing populist movements. We are facing disenfranchisement from large segments of the population, a rejection of elites or a rebellion against elites in society, a demand for change, a perception that political parties are not delivering or that political parties are not listening to what their people are saying. We are seeing this in the United States. We are seeing this in Britain with the Brexit. We saw this in France with the popularity of the National Front, even though Marine Le Pen did not win the election. We see it with the Alternative for Deutschland, even though they don't look poised to win either. They are making a mark. We see it in other countries, such as Poland, where populist movements have come to government. We see it in countries like Hungary, where a government is trying to navigate how to capitalize on populism, but also to try to stay within certain bounds. We see it throughout Sweden, Finland, Italy, you name it. So the topic of this conversation is, what are the challenges that we are all facing with populism and democracy? Is this a phase we're going through? Is it a systemic challenge? And how do we need to understand it and deal with that? We have an excellent panel of experts to discuss this. To introduce the panel and to moderate this discussion, I'd like to introduce Chris Walker.
Thank you very much, Kurt. And I'd like to thank Kurt and Nino for all they do to put together such a terrific conference. I'd also like to thank them for moving outside and having us al fresco on such a nice day. That is a stroke of brilliance, so thank you for that. As Kurt noted, we're going to try to tackle some big issues here. We're going to move the lens back a bit and think about some of the larger challenges that we're facing. And before we get into the conversation, I'd just like to give a couple of thoughts to frame the discussion. The first is, the world has changed quite considerably, even since a year ago when we were here, in ways we can't imagine. This includes some of the challenges we've seen in advanced democracies, but if we were sitting here 10 years ago, we wouldn't have realized the extent to which the degree of repression within authoritarian regimes would have become so acute. This has really been the most significant change over the last years. If you look at countries as diverse as China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, the Middle East in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, all of these countries over the last 10 years, according to Freedom House, have become even more repressive, having started at quite repressive levels, looking through the lens of about a 10-year period. In the meantime, we've seen a number of countries in cases which not too long ago were considered democratic hopefuls, which in this period, in the most recent period, have really start to show serious elements of democratic erosion, and even worse. And in this respect, we could cite countries like Turkey, the Philippines, Poland, Hungary, country like South Africa. This is a global challenge, almost as large as the one speaking over the construction in the building next door. So this is two pieces of the puzzle. And then in the most recent period, we've seen the advanced democracies start to be hit with some of the trends that were evident in the worst performers and in some of the countries that were hopefuls. And I think this is the larger frame for the challenge we're facing in the context of what many are calling populism, but these days that's all too frequently conflated with authoritarianism, which it, in my view, doesn't necessarily have to be. So I think some of the issues we can touch on in this discussion relate to the relationship between democracy and populism, the relationship between authoritarianism and populism, and also populism and liberalism. This is part of the title of the discussion. I think this is all fertile terrain for trying to get our grounding for responding to this challenge in a way that can help democracies and democratic hopefuls perform better in this very challenging new context. And so for all of these reasons, I'm really delighted we have such a terrific group of speakers. As I noted, we'll start with a conversation. We'll hear from each of them to get their initial sense. I'll probably pose a question or two here, and then we'll open it up for discussions, try to keep this as fast-moving and interactive as we can. And so to start things off, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Daniel Fried, who has given a good deal of thought to these issues on many different levels, and we'll hear from him first.
To paraphrase Bismarck, the situation in the West is serious but not hopeless. The problem the West faces is that we are in one of these cyclical sags of our self-confidence. And we've had previous sags in the 1970s and the 1930s. We recovered in the 1970s without a catastrophe. In the 1930s, we didn't recover until there was a catastrophe. So we have work to do, and there are problems. Now, to my Georgian friends, I would say this may look both peculiar and alarming to you, but I can assure you that the alarm is not yours alone. We are all of your friends in the United States, and I think your friends in Europe are equally worried about these trends. So we've heard from Kurt, we've just heard now some of the symptoms. And I've been thinking about some of the causes of this democratic sag, and it's particularly ironic that it happens after the greatest generation in the history of democracy, because from 1989 and 1991, for the next 20 years, we had a tremendous run of success, which benefited Georgia, though not as much as some of us and the Georgians hoped. But what went wrong, and what do we do about it? Now, I'm speaking from the perspective of an American and someone familiar with Europe, and I'm going to define Europe for the purposes of this argument as institutional Europe, the EU and NATO zone. What went wrong was first economics. Europe has had 10 or 15 years of relative stagnation and high unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, low growth. The United States has less stagnation, but we have much more income disparity. It's what I call the Titanic effect. First class lives very well, steerage class lives worse. And that, we have levels of income disparity in the United States we haven't seen in 100 years. And that is not sustainable in a democracy like ours. The second problem is that the political systems in Europe and the United States have not been equal to the task. In the United States, we have seen political dysfunction throughout most of the year, all of the years of the Obama administration, and that following the crash in the last year, the economic crash and financial crisis in the last year of the Bush administration. In Europe, you have seen a less effective EU than many of us had hoped, problems over the Greek debt crisis, and the paralysis of the European Union when it comes to re-stimulating the economy. So to be clear, I like Chancellor Merkel's policies in most things. It's rare that I am critical, but I actually side more with the French and more with the stimulus side of the European economic debate. But in the Americans, in the United States, we have not even begun to grapple with the problem of income disparity. So we have the economics, and we have the difficult politics. And that has led, combined with the immigration parallel problems, Latino immigration in the United States, which is not properly speaking that much of a problem, but put that aside, it is seen as a problem, and immigration and refugees from North Africa and the Middle East to Europe has triggered in both Western Europe and the United States issues of national identity and triggered nativism. Now, for those in Georgia familiar with the America of the Statue of Liberty and America as melting pot, the current nativist wave in my country might come as a surprise, but the dirty secret is America does get immigration right, but only after a very nasty period often of bigotry and violence. Go ask the Chinese, the Irish, the Italians, the Japanese. We always get it right in the end, but getting to the end has been a problem. Issues of national identity and how to keep defining national identity in sustainable cultural and linguistic terms, but not ethnic terms, is a continuing challenge. Ethnic-based national identity is impossible to sustain in the United States because we are a nation of immigrants. It is, I suspect, challenging to maintain in Europe because ethnically homogeneous nation-states are under pressure. Those three issues have combined to produce rather exotic and difficult politics. Now, the Europeans here, the West Europeans here are going to object that I'm oversimplifying, to which I plead guilty. I am. But the purpose of this discussion is to frame up the issues, so bear with me. What do we do about it? We need to tackle the economic problems. We need to tackle our politics so we are dealing with the economic problems, and we need to redefine our nations in sustainable terms for the 21st century. Now, into all of this, you notice I haven't mentioned the Russians, but I'm about to. The Russians are not the cause of our problems, but they are feeding on our problems, taking advantage of them. They love it. Whether you want to use, there are various ugly analogies you could use, but the fact is the Russians want to discredit the idea of democracy and to weaken us, the better to protect themselves. This is not the time to talk about Russian policy, but I will indulge and say that the Russian objective is to make the world safe for Russian autocracy. The stronger our democracies are, the more Putinism is under pressure. They want to weaken us, both to make Russian power safer and the better to dominate their neighbors such as Georgia and Ukraine, which are still resisting in various ways Russian pressure. But beyond the policy specifics, we need to remember who we are in the West. I hate the phrase liberal international order. If you're an American from Washington or New York, or a European at all, please do not go to Biloxi, Mississippi, or Lubbock, Texas, or Reading, Pennsylvania, and talk about the liberal international order. You will have lost your audience with that first word. But what we need to defend and remember is that we are part of the free world, which is not the same as the West. The West is Europe and its legacy nations. The free world is bigger. It includes Japan. It includes Korea. It will hopefully include Argentina and Brazil and India. The free world is the best idea we've got. It really is the globalization of Immanuel Kant's vision of perpetual peace. Okay? It's a European idea, but the Americans, being Americans, sort of put it on steroids and we got all excited about it. And I say that without irony, because after 1945, the notion of the free world accomplished great things. And we are in danger of forgetting how much we achieved. We need to push back on the Russians and on our own nativists and on those, as an American, I will say, those Americans who want to forget who we are. America's grand strategy in the world did not begin in 1945. It begins in 1900, when we realized, the generation away from the Civil War, that we were strong and that we would replace, in some sense, the British Empire, not with our own empire, but with a vision of a free world in which America would do the right thing and get very rich in the process, but we would not prosper unless everybody else did. It was typical American naivete and optimism combined with a certain sense of the moment. We Americans have to remember our own grand strategy, and we have to link arms with Europe and open ourselves to the broader free world and push back on the Russians. So I've tried to frame up where I think the problems are, and to the Georgians I would say this: do the work you need to do at home right now. Don't wait. But in doing so, you will keep yourselves free from the Russians and ready, because we will come back. I just hope not too much damage is done in the meantime. So, back to you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much for that. I think you did a wonderful job framing the scope of the challenge and cited the democracy's flagging competence and the fact that we're in a cyclical sag at the moment. And maybe we can discuss that a little bit more, whether we've reached a tipping point of sorts given the degree of the change that both the advanced democracies and others have faced, or whether this is a cyclical stage from which we can self-correct and propel ourselves out of it. And on that, I'd like to turn to Robin Shepherd to talk a little bit more about some of the critical issues that have developed in the most recent period and the populist question.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to go right back to one point, point you raised as well, Christopher, that Dan raised at the beginning about the cyclical sag. And I'll just make this as a point to hopefully introduce another element into the discussion before I make the remarks that I wanted to make in opening this discussion from my point of view. The big difference is the digital revolution. We can look at past events, we can look at past problems where populism or threats or challenges to democracy have been made. But one thing that has changed fundamentally about this current cycle, to appropriate your terminology, is that people who never had a voice before, and people who could never form groups, and it is the group forming capacity of the digital revolution that's often missed. Everyone gets the point about emails being fast and Twitter being fast and Facebook being, you communicate when you're on holiday in South Africa with your mother in New Zealand. Everyone gets that. What is fundamentally new is the group forming capacity. People could talk in their cafes, in their pubs, in their living rooms. Nowadays, they can talk in groups which can become enormous in the space of a few seconds or a few minutes. And I think that while I don't disagree with your optimism about how we can get through this cycle, we do have to recognize that there is something very, very different about today. And the digital revolution is one of the things that it is. This question of populism, there's a great danger with populism that it just becomes a boo word. Somebody's a populist, therefore they're bad, therefore we can dismiss everything they say. Kaz Wude, if I pronounce the name correctly, from the University of Georgia, has described quite recently populism as a thin ideology. And what that means is that once you designate somebody a populist, or once you describe something as populism, you haven't actually told us very much about what it is they want to do. Now, part of the reason for that is that populism is a kind of anti-ideology. It doesn't really have an awful lot in there, hence the word a thin ideology, which you can grasp onto. But there are certain themes evident in what we tend to call populism, which are common across the world. Latin America, Europe particularly, also these days the United States. And one of them, of course, is the idea of the people versus the elites. The people versus those in power who have got it all wrapped up. The people who Bernie Sanders described as running the rigged economy, or people talk about inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. as a kind of racket, or they talk about the Westminster Village in London, or the Brussels elite. And that kind of theme, that there are the people who are somewhat downtrodden, who haven't been having their voices heard, and the elite up there, is common to almost all of the movements and people that we describe as populist. There was an interesting observation that I read the other day about Donald Trump and the sense in which Trump, according to this line of thinking, became a populist. And that when he gave his announcement that he was going to run for presidency, in that speech, he used the word I, as in I as opposed to you and we. He used the word I 256 times. By the time you got to Inauguration Day, the day when he was sworn in as president, in that speech, he used the word I 3 times. Because what had changed, and a lot of people have used Stephen Bannon as the ideological forcing mechanism pushing Trump towards populism when it was purely a kind of narcissistic kind of platform to start with, is the notion of the people. And in that inauguration speech, I can remember it's almost a quotation, but it might be a close paraphrase. He said that the difference between this presidency and the ones before it is that this is not a change of administration from one administration to another. It is a change of power from Washington, D.C., and I quote, to you, the people. So this theme of the people versus the elites is central to almost all of the populist movements, or so-called populist movements you can describe. But I want to raise a red flag right here and come back to this point about it being a boo word. Just because a populist says something, it doesn't make it wrong. Right? I've often used this thing about, not at all to trivialize, but, you know, Eva Braun and Adolf Hitler around the dinner table. I'm sure at some point that Adolf asked Eva, pass the salt. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you and I asking someone to pass the salt. It doesn't make it wrong because someone we don't like has said something. And the idea, which is central to the populist movements, that there is something wrong with what is going on, primarily in Western Europe, and I now take the countries of the European Union who were formerly communist as West European countries, and North America, is that there is a case to answer here. This is not an invented grievance. And I was struck by this 11 years ago now, I guess, and I at that stage my thinking was in a very formative stage. I can't say I had a crystal ball, but I wrote an op-ed for the International Herald Tribune, now the New York Times International. And it was based on a case of Ferenc Gyurcsány, who was the socialist prime minister at the time. And there is a very famous case where he was caught on tape saying that he had lied to the people, to his electors, morning, noon, and night. And he was glorying in it. He was actually glorying. He was like, now, I'm the real deal. I'm a real politician. I lie to the public. This was 2006, long before we'd heard of Viktor Orban, but he hadn't yet assumed the prime ministership to the extent and with the degree of anti-democratic luster that he has today. And I made the point that, you know, if you're going to trash your own people in the way that Gyurcsány did, in glorying about having lied to them, there are consequences. You can't do that. You can't humiliate your own people and expect that there won't be consequences. And I did say in the article that there are deep undercurrents of resentful nationalism. I didn't know that, as I say, I didn't have a crystal ball. But there are certain things you can't do and certain modes of behavior which have become normalized inside the elites in Western Europe and the United States and to some extent in Canada too, which are unacceptable. It is unacceptable to glory in the fact that you've lied to your own voters, long before we'd heard of fake news. But what really struck me was that after I'd written that article, I was in conversation with a very senior Western journalist who covered Central and Eastern Europe. I won't mention his name or the organization he represented, but suffice to say, you've all heard of it. And he said to me, yeah, I saw your article and I didn't like it. And well, you know, you can't please everyone, fair enough. And he said, I didn't like its high moral tone. And as I was going on the train from Budapest up to Bratislava, where I have an apartment and I know that part of the world very well, I kind of thought, what high moral tone? I didn't ask the Prime Minister of Hungary to take a vow of poverty, to renounce all earthly goods. I didn't say that, make comment about him being a husband, good or bad, or a father, good or bad. I just said that if you're going to lie to the public and then glory in it, there are going to be consequences. The most basic minimum about political morality, and yet for this person I was just talking to, this was a high moral tone. And what that told me was something that I've seen repeated again and again, is that very poor standards of behavior, up to and including, as we've seen in some cases, the expenses scandal in the UK, many cases of politicians who end up in prison, or, as Bernie Sanders pointed out in the election campaign, not just banks which are too big to fail, but bankers guilty of conduct which certainly rises to the level that could be considered criminal, too big to jail, that this idea within the establishment that these modes of behavior are normal and acceptable, that's going to cause serious problems. So, the populists are, in my opinion, uniformly bad. This is a bad thing to be going on. It's something I disapprove of. But you are never going to get to the place that Dan wants us to get to, which is to address and solve this problem, unless you acknowledge that they're not just inventing grievances here, that there are real deep-seated problems in the way that we run our political economy.
So, Robin, you've raised a lot of food for thought, and one of the questions which I hope we'll return to before we conclude the discussion is how it is that the democracies can take steps to deprive the populists of seizing on the sorts of issues that they've been able to exploit. Because in the absence of that sort of response from liberal Democrats, small l, small d, we'll be facing this problem for quite some time to come, I suspect. You've also raised the issue of how the digital revolution has impacted the current political landscape, and someone else made the observation that Twitter, by its very nature, 140 characters, not well considered, is populist inherently. And so I wanted to use that as a segue to Alina, who's looked at developments in Central and Eastern Europe extensively, and how some of the movements there are not solely indigenous, but actually are propelled by outside forces who are rather adept at using digital tools for those purposes. So maybe you can get to that point at some point if you were going to say something else, but I wanted to make sure, because you've studied it so much, we could touch on it.
Well, thank you, Chris, and again, thank you to our hosts here in Tbilisi. I'm really delighted to be here and to be on this panel. I wanted to pick up on a few themes before getting to the point you raised, that were already raised by my esteemed colleagues. One is the conversation we're starting to have about what is populism and what does it mean. You brought up this idea that has been popularized by Kas Muda, a colleague of mine from back in my academic days, that it's a thin ideology. But I actually think that obfuscates what he actually means in a very academic way when he uses that terminology. Because at the end of the day, populism is not an ideology in the sense that we think of ideology. So it's not a coherent system of thoughts strung together in the pursuit of some political agenda, like a communist ideology, for example. It is in fact a political tool that can be used by the left or the right, and in some instances even by centrists who are trying to steal or carve out a space for themselves. And now we'll have a conversation about France specifically, but some would say that Macron used populism in a way to get at some of Le Pen's supporters, to cohere the center from the left and the right. So I think thinking about it as a tool versus an ideology just clears that up for us, and then also goes to the point that you raised, Chris, about this conflation of populism and authoritarianism, because, again, we are seeing trends, particularly in Europe, but not just in Central Eastern Europe, towards this marriage of the far-right authoritarians or nationalists who are also using an increasingly populist rhetoric to propel their agenda forward. So, on the other hand, the other conversation we're starting to have that I think we should continue to go back to is the cyclical question. Ambassador Volker also brought this up in his opening remarks. You know, is this a phase, or is there some broader, more long-term systemic change that we're going through, whether that be in Central Eastern Europe, whether that be in Western Europe, whether that be in South America, or elsewhere? My sense and my view on this specific question of cycles is that far-right authoritarian or nationalist parties in Europe have been around for a very long time. Certainly because of World War II, there was a sort of a dropout of parties of the far right for obvious reasons, but they reemerged relatively quickly in places like Austria, where the Freedom Party, the current strongest party in the Austrian parliament, if I'm not mistaken, was founded in 1956. The National Front was founded in the 1970s. So it's not that these political movements have completely died off and now suddenly they have once again come back into the limelight. We're talking about them again quite a bit. But the reality is that this has been a slow building process. And for the most part, politicians of the center and of the right, the center right, have dismissed these political parties as either fringe movements that will just fade away, as single issue parties that had one idea, and as soon as that idea was taken care of by the mainstream parties, they would just fade away. And what we're facing now is the stark reality that none of this has actually happened. And I think going forward, it's not that populist far-right movements have reached sort of a peak in Europe. All of us, of course, were, I think, elated to see the election of Macron and not Marine Le Pen in France. But I think at the same time, this doesn't signal that this is the end of that phase in our political space. I think it's actually just a sign of things to come. So in many ways, my remarks are more about the dark side of the vision that Ambassador Fried, I think, so compellingly laid out. And I agree that we have also misunderstood and dismissed these quote-unquote fringe movements that are no longer fringe in most European democracies because we wanted to believe that they were having another moment, that they were receiving more and more support because of Europe's economic stagnation. So yes, Europe has been muddling through for over a decade now through many, many crises, starting the economic crisis, even prior to that, the refugee inflows, of course, the terrible terrorist attacks that we've seen. And in a way, it's as if every crisis, the EU moves anew, and it's not necessarily prepared to deal with these types of events. And this kind of muddling through, at the same time as the EU has expanded in such a profound way and so rapidly, has produced a cultural backlash. So it's much less about economics and economic stagnation, or even, I would argue, youth unemployment, because in countries like Austria, which had very low unemployment, very low youth unemployment throughout the economic crisis, at the same time we saw the emergence of the Freedom Party. So there are many counterexamples we could point to that complicate the argument about economics, and I think now there is a realization that this is much more about identity, and this is about culture, and that is a much more murky and difficult concept for us to grasp. It's easy to say, well, when unemployment goes up and communities aren't doing so well economically, people look to other alternatives that are a bit more radical, that want to change the current situation. But that's simply not the case if we look at just a little bit more historically over the last 15 to 20 years. And on the other hand, the other point I'd like to put out there is that populist far-right parties and also far-left parties are a symptom. And they're a symptom of what I think is a much more critical and profound problems in our current democratic societies, particularly in Europe. And that is the collapse, or the coming collapse, of the center-left. We have to look no further than the elections that just happened this year, or happening in Germany at the end of this month. Look at what happened in the Netherlands with the center-left Socialist Party. They collapsed. They went from having 25% of the vote to having a little less than 6% of the vote. We had the same thing happen in France. The socialists are irrelevant, essentially. They used to be a mainstream party. They used to have the presidency. How do you go from that to about 6% of the vote? And in countries like the UK, of course, the center-left Labour Party has moved so far to the extreme that it's probably left a lot of its constituencies behind. And so what happens to those constituents that are left behind and that have no home? Well, they're not going to the center-right Republicans or other parties of the conservative but still moderate center. Many of them are going to the far right. And also realizing that there is a growing group of people, because of trends in globalization, inequality, but also because of the failure of our political class and our political leadership to address their real life grievances and these identity questions that everybody's very uncomfortable talking about. And this is what's leading to, I think, a profound transformation of our political systems. And we'll see what happens in Germany, but I'm not going to make a prediction, but I wouldn't be surprised if the SPD does significantly worse than is actually being even predicted today. So I think that is the flip side, to my mind, of what we're talking about now, the problem of populism. It is this thinning out of the center and the failure of the center to respond to the challenge from the far right and the far left. And if we look at, just very briefly, as to how the center-right is dealing with the challenge from the far right, because we are going to see more and more far-right populist authoritarian parties in European parliaments. The Alternative for Germany will enter the German parliament. This is the first time this will happen in Germany since the war. It's a significant development. Many of these parties are pandering to the far right. They're taking up the anti-immigrant, the illiberal agenda of the far right. And what does that do? It moves our entire political spectrum and legitimates the views that used to be illegitimate, and it makes them credible in our mainstream discourse. And lastly, to go back very quickly to the point that you brought up, Russia, of course, has a role in fanning the flames of polarization and division in these countries. Clearly, it is not because of Putin that we had Brexit. It is not because of Putin that we had the economic crisis or the sovereign debt crisis or the many divisions that revealed within the EU and between European member states. But if we simply look at what Russian state media says, if you ever watch, Channel 1 in Russian, feel very sorry for you, but it is kind of entertaining and it is a useful tool for understanding what the Kremlin is trying to project. And what they're trying to project is a vision and a narrative of an increasingly divisive or divided Europe that is in a cultural decline and that is no longer the kind of beacon of liberalism with a small L, beacon of democracy, a beacon of free world, that it is a place that is in ruin and in chaos. And this message is finding more and more appeal, I think, unfortunately, because it's being propagated by the very far-right movements that benefit from it, with the help of Russian state-sponsored media, also social media, botnets, and trolls, and all of this that you're referring to, the emergence of the digital revolution. So I think to close, I just wanted to put a few more skeptical ideas out there for the conversation.
Thank you, Alina. You've really helped sharpen the discussion on a number of levels. I think one of the things I take away from your observations is how dramatically the margins have moved to the mainstream. And I think that's at least in part a reflection of Robin's observation on the impact of digital media. If you have an independent variable you could look at for how politics are impacted today and how voice is given to groups that didn't have a voice and how groups are able to find each other, coordinate, and how they're able to be amplified and accelerated in the current environment. This is really a different political landscape. And of course, this is happening at the same time that established political parties are weaker and more fragmented, atomized. I think part of this discussion, coming back to the initial remarks by Dan Fried, is what sorts of measures we can take to have greater unity and solidarity and cohesiveness in the face of this underlying atomization that we're seeing on so many levels. But I'd like to turn now, we've moved through Europe and coming to Georgia and hear from David Sikharulidze for his reflections on what's been discussed.
Thank you, Chris. The problem of building democratic free state here has been already 27 years we've been building it. There are certain objective problems, of course, as every post-totalitarian country. Georgia inherited enormous size of the government, which, I mean, by saying the big, by talking about the size of government, I'm not talking about the, I'm not in the traditional, liberal conservative debate. The size of the government that penetrates every aspect of public life. Just, I'm not going to expand on this further, but just to illustrate it is, for example, after 2012 elections, when government changed, that also caused change of director of opera house, of every sport federation, and as well as, I don't know, university rectors. I mean, the size of the government is huge. Therefore, I mean, it represents serious challenge for forming interest groups within, and then when the government infiltrates every aspect of public life, I mean, it takes much longer to form the liberal groups that have their own interests. Secondly, I think that this in this situation we also have a type of parties that, well, not all of them, but mostly sometimes it happens when the party becomes a ruling party, the big tent parties, with no ideology, but then the end itself is to have power and then hold this power for longer time. So, but nevertheless, I think that, of course, the third major challenge is the weak economy and overall, the overall small size of economy in general, that makes country vulnerable not only to Russian influence and the Russian hybrid war, different tools of the Russian hybrid war, but also to influence of oligarchs and then oligarchic influence, which becomes sometimes very big. However, well, Georgia managed to make some very important reforms that primarily were focusing on the strengthening of Georgia's state institutions. And without strengthening these institutions, of course, it's impossible to further liberalize the governance and society. Also we can't. What we've been in, nothing is new under the sun, and now there are more and more talks about the Russia's hybrid war over not only its neighborhood but also over against the free world. But we've been experiencing it for quite a long time, and I think it started somewhere in 20s with Bolsheviks when Bolsheviks came to power, and then it was the case all the way through Cold War. But Georgia was experiencing this hybrid offensive, let's say, for the last 27 years, and it has every component of the hybrid war in it. It's not only military operations, military or paramilitary operations, or even special services infiltration into the Georgian state institutions, but also economic components of the hybrid war, such as manipulation of economic tools of the state, as well as now very well-known, I would call it psychological operations rather than propaganda, poorly propaganda. So I think that Russia understands very well its advantages, strategic advantages, and what strategic advantages have totalitarian states have over free states and the liberal states. But there is the one major advantage free world has over totalitarian states, and this is the democratic solidarity, which has been weakened recently. So, as true Georgian, I'd like to come up with the toast, British toast. It comes from 1982, when Thatcher, Prime Minister Thatcher, was hosting President Reagan in London And on state dinner, she raised glass for Reagan, for men who put freedom on offensive where it belongs. Every American president, from Harry Truman to George W. Bush, was supporting this democratic solidarity and was supporting democracies abroad. Not only because they believed in the values that America represents, but also because it was the sure way to more secure, stable, and more prosperous world. So all those three major components that visionary President Truman came up with: NATO as a hard power, with Marshall Plan as a economic power, and with the democracy as the way of life, way of components of almost every American president, from Truman to George W. Bush. Well, I think I'm not revealing big secret then, but I can't. There were countless times you gave me hard time while being in Washington, when we had problems with democracy, and that repeals myth that Bush administration was really not overlooking the problems with the democratic building in Georgia. That's not true at all. But it was very clear sign of support, and as we discussed yesterday, that U.S. cared about Georgia. So democratic solidarity and attention to democratic process in Georgia is yet another and absolutely necessary component of success, not only Georgia or Russia's neighbors, but also success of free world. So let me stop here and be glad to participate in the discussion further.
So David, I wanted to thank you for making this point that having a positive forward vision for supporting democracy in freedom is important both at home within the democracies, but also abroad, because when this is weakened at home, it impacts what's happening abroad and vice versa. And I think to the extent we're now in a cyclical phase, we should discuss perhaps for a moment how we can climb our way out of this, what steps we would take. And so I'll ask the speakers to address some form of these questions. I'd also like to integrate questions from the audience. We can build them into the discussion for those who might have them. But why don't I start with Dan Fried, just to talk a little bit about what sorts of things we are not doing now that we might do to propel us out of this bad cycle.
We need to hold the line. I think Vice President's trip to Tallinn and Tbilisi was critical in that respect, because it reminded the people of this region and it reminded the Russians of our principles. So, not a step backward. And in that regard, I think Kurt Volker is the right man at the right time to do the Ukraine negotiations. So, not a step backward. And secondly, remember what we stand for, which means continue to give Georgia a hard time about democracy. It shows we care. And third, think of the future. Don't simply deal with the current problems. When we're thinking about Russia, when we're thinking about the lands between institutional Europe and Russia, remember what it is we set out to achieve in 1989 and 1991, and mean it. Easier said than done, but I will say, in defense of the Obama administration and so far the Trump administration, when put to the test with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Obama people stepped up, both in NATO and with sanctions. And the Trump administration is, as was said of Wagner's music, better than it sounds. The policy is, you can see, you can discern, if you look hard enough and optimistically enough, a reasonable policy. So that's my answer.
And I'm just being told right now that we only have a couple of more minutes. And so if there are one or two questions, we can take them and then we'll work our way for very succinct answers or last reflections from the panel. So let me turn to Alina in the absence of questions if you'd like to share some thoughts on what else we could and should be doing to tackle the challenge.
Sure. I think I'll go back to the question you raised initially to me, Chris. One, I'm not 100% sure, nor do I believe that we are indeed in a cycle that we're going to come out of. What if we have to face the reality that this is not a cycle, but a profound shift in the international structure, right? And we need to prepare for that, frankly, because we can't just assume that we're going to get out of this. But given that, we should certainly try and hold the line, as Ambassador Fried says. As part of that, it has been, I think it's become very obvious to those of us in the United States and also our European colleagues and allies that we, as democratic countries, are very vulnerable, and that democracies are not going to necessarily be there forever. And even though we're vulnerable, we are also very resilient, and we are far more resilient than the totalitarian or authoritarian regimes that try to undermine us. And then with that, to this question of Russia's meddling in our electoral processes, in our democracies, through these various influence operations in the media space, in the economic space, or through kleptocracy and other forms of corruption, we have to identify those weaknesses that these countries, like Russia, but there will be others, and there are already others, as you well know, Chris, like China, for example, that have a much more profound economic foothold in places like Greece than Russia ever will. And we have to understand what those vulnerabilities are, and I think one of them is a lack of investment in our independent media space and civil society. I think this needs to change. I think governments can do a lot to move civil society in the right direction, to put resources where they belong, and on the other hand, to understand what our weaknesses have been in terms of the gaps in whether it be in our cybersecurity infrastructures or in our own interpretation of events and our government's relationship with the media companies and the tech platforms that have been used and manipulated by malicious state actors and also non-state actors. So I think just starting there and understanding what the problems are, what the vulnerabilities are, and how do we close them, and that should focus on independent civil society space, in my view.
Thank you for that. And on China, I would say just very briefly, there's really a need for more scrutiny and study of China's 16+1 initiative, which is targeted on the new EU member states and a number of states in southeastern Europe. It's not just an economic strategy. There's a very significant political dimension to this, which to date has not gotten sufficient scrutiny. So let's hear from Robin and then David, and then we'll bring it to a close, just very briefly.
Thank you. I'm with Alina in this. I think the problems are far more deep-seated than many want to acknowledge. I want to press home in these final remarks the point about the digital revolution, that this is a one-time world historic shift. And I think people, mainly perhaps because most of the people who sit on panels like these and write op-eds in the newspapers, they owe their success in life to the analog world, and they're not naturally predisposed to be sympathetic or even necessarily to understand just how profound this shift is. We're never going back to the day when the only option for the average person in their lifetime is once to make themselves heard by getting a letter to the editor published in the New York Times. Those days are definitively gone, and that means we live in a different kind of democratic society than the one that preceded it. To answer Christopher's point about wrapping up and what we have to do, number one, acknowledge that, but also acknowledge the nature of the problem with the analog society which we have inherited. If you look at opinion polls, there is masses, as I'm sure Alina will testify, of opinion poll evidence, of survey evidence out there across democracies in the West, where 70, 80% of the population does not trust, and it doesn't just mean they've got a little bit of a problem, they fundamentally distrust our political parties. They're not even, in a lot of cases, particularly sure about the judicial system. They don't trust what they read in the mainstream media. And here's the key point. there are very good reasons for that distrust. And we are going nowhere in addressing this problem until we have acknowledged and internalized, at which point we can address the nature of the problem. That after the 2008 financial crisis, which was much more than just a financial crisis, the fact is practically nobody who was at the center of that crisis paid a price. Practically everybody who made large amounts of money or had good positions in central banks or regulatory authorities, they either still have them today or they're living in very good pensions on the basis of that. And what the digital revolution has done is put all of that right in everybody's face. So, on the understanding that we only have a few seconds to wrap up, if there's one thing I would like everyone to go away with, is much as we criticize the populists, and rightly so, there are lots of very unpleasant people, very unpleasant things coming with populism, try and look at the world through people's eyes who have been attracted to these movements. Why? Have they just become irrational overnight? Very unlikely that 62.9 million Americans transformed on election day last year from being sober-minded, reasonable people to being bigots and racists and living in invented fantasies about corruption in the political economy that they live in. There is a real problem, and we will sit here year after year. We may not sit here year after year if these populist movements become more and more advanced, but the risk is we sit here year after year just saying how terrible these people are, and we don't acknowledge there is a problem which is inside our own establishments. We have to deal with that problem, otherwise the problem won't go away.
And as we hear the last word from David, I would just use this as a way of framing this challenge off of what Dan Fried mentioned. I think Georgia's democratic success and its demonstration effect in this current context is as important as ever. So, David, very briefly, if you want to say...
Yeah, very briefly, just on the holding the line, and I think that's it's key. But I'm afraid we are not holding the line. We are just dragging back. And by doing, it's when Forrest Gump movie comes to the front line in Vietnam, he asks the lieutenant what to do. He said, don't do something stupid. So I think that is a good advice for Georgia, and I'm afraid we are doing something stupid here. We all here heard the discussion about the Constitution during the last panel. Well, I will not comment on the particular aspects of this, but the biggest stupidity we are doing here, and not we, but I think that the biggest mistake the ruling party is now doing is the further polarizing the society when historically, I can't recall the situation when entire political spectrum and civil society organizations are on the one side, and then the ruling party is on another side. So, Russian hybrid war is directed to further polarize society, and we are not holding line here. We are just doing stupid things. The second, domination of partisan agenda over that partisan agenda that harms national interests. So this debate, Georgian participants are well aware of this debate, who started the war in 2008, which I think is crazy debate. That really is not helping to Georgia to hold the line. I would say more. Not only hold the line, but advance. And by advancing, I mean to have to continue reforms that are strengthening Georgia's state institutions and that promoting Georgia's cause to become NATO member and European Union member.
So we've had just an enormously complex set of issues that I think have been tackled very thoughtfully in a very short period of time. And I know it's so short because Kurt is slowly kind of gravitating towards me. So I apologize to those who didn't have a chance to ask a question, but I'm going to hand it over to Kurt Volker because I know we have to move to the next session.
And thank you all very much to the panel. And thank you, Chris, for doing a great job pulling a complicated topic together. My summary in one sentence is the glass is either half empty or half full, and it's really up to us. So thank you all. If I could ask our next speakers to come up immediately. Batu, Prime Minister Ed Chow, And we're going to switch right here in place. Please stay put. And we're going to try to stay as close to on schedule as possible.